What an exciting time right now to be working on red seaweed across the globe, especially those of us that enjoy the warmer water varieties like the eukumatoids. My name's Professor Nick Paul from the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and it's a great pleasure to be presenting at the workshop today around innovations and impact of seaweed production and processing in Indonesia. Perfect timing for us as we've just completed a 5-year project funded by the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research that really aimed to provide the scientific basis to transform the Indonesian seaweed industry, looking at a whole of value chain approach and some of the key production constraints, as well as a whole range of diverse new product opportunities. This was a large partnership with more than 30 core staff across Indonesia and Australia. We have partners from the Research Centre and Development Centre for Marine and Fisheries Product Processing and Biotechnology in Jakarta, the Centre for Seaweed Culture Research and Development in Gorontalo, brackish water aquaculture development centres in Takala and Ujung Banti, as well as Hasanuddin University and Stitek College of Marine Technology, both in Makassar. And we'll be going through a number of the different projects, both in the presentation today and also in the workshop. So the project itself had a pretty broad remit and conducted research across a whole range of different species, but primarily what we're going to talk about today and what the work comprised of was Capophycus alvarezi, so aka cotton eye in the industry, which is major production across eastern Indonesia in particular, but also other places. And we can see Pak Rani Pongmasak from the Gorontalo Research Centre. They're handling some seaweed, and for those that want to, they should click on and see his talk about all different types of production constraints. The early scoping work that we did in the project back in 2015, really looking at some of the production issues initially, the decline in quality of seaweeds, particularly the gel strength, and also perceived colour problems with the processed product, and ultimately trying to understand that variation in product quality and also production across different places under different environmental conditions, trying to work out how the deterioration in gel strength might be linked to these things. From the Indonesian perspective, the government of Indonesia had really clearly articulated that there should be a focus on cultivating species that can value add to the existing industry. This type of processing that can be done should be as close as possible to the production areas where the seaweed is being farmed, and obviously trying to identify a whole range of new products that can enable further growth that can sustain the incredible growth that's already occurred so far in Indonesia. From a supply chain point of view, it's relatively linear at the moment. We have sustainable aquaculture production of Capophycus in nearshore environments primarily. That seaweed is then harvested and then moved or sort of handled in a fresh point of view. It's dried in a number of different scenarios. It's then shipped to existing processing centres, and lots more of these processing areas are popping up across Indonesia. The primary product is the carrageenan gel of various different levels of refinement in Indonesia, and ultimately this is being used in a range of packaged food and beverage applications, amongst other things, as we all know. So for us, taking that whole of value chain, really trying to understand where across that entire space can we start to add value. There were 3 objectives in the project, and I'll go through each of those as well as the research outputs as a summary. So the first objective was to analyse the value chains and look for constraints and knowledge gaps in seaweed production meaning the entire sort of process at this point in Indonesia. And so focusing on those established seaweeds, the Capophycus, as well as the eucuma that are produced for carrageenan, trying to get insights from across the spectrum of farmers, traders and processors. So how much seaweed is being produced and processed in Indonesia? Where is it actually occurring right now, and how is this changing over time? There was also a chance to understand different aspects across that supply chain in terms of biomass quality, particularly moisture content and impurities were things that we were getting feedback about. So how are these constraints manifesting in the value chain? some of the work that came out of that was to identify particular parts of the existing industry, essentially bright spots that might actually be useful for emerging areas of production across the country. Indonesia being such a large archipelago with lots of potential areas for production, but not necessarily all the processes in place to do that. One of the areas of work by Dr. Harry Panomo and team was looking at the warehouse system that's actually played such a crucial role in South Sulawesi in terms of actually issuing these transferable certified proof of ownership of the actual products. And so that guarantee that gives in terms of quality and price has been thought to be quite important for South Sulawesi, and that's certainly one of the major production areas in the country. So the question that was being asked is, can that actual system be adopted on Java, which doesn't have a lot of production? Most of the sort of production and processing is happening for carrageenan in Sulawesi Selatan. But there are a few production areas that are emerging in Java. And so these main production areas really in Java need a range of different types of support, both from an infrastructure point of view, so classic scenarios, power, and even better international shipping capacity, as well as that institutional support that can bring it all together, both from the government and business participation sides of things. Across that chain, while the team was walking the chain, essentially talking to farmers, talking to traders, there was also this adopted approach, the Kaizen style approach, which was how do we actually continue to change towards the better? And so one of the key things that was made clear is that there needs to be a way to improve the upstream margin, so closer to the farmer scale, and that's certainly something that ACR in Australia is interested in as well, in boosting the livelihood impacts of smallholder farmers. And so can we actually find some ways that can bring more value upstream as well as motivate potentially more business development? And some of the key things that came out in that process and publication was the drying and the quality and variation in the culture production and the productivity. So there were different types of recommendations, multiple species as well, but even simple, relatively straightforward things like using a monofilament net to dry the seaweed in a consistent way and optimizing the spacing of your cultures, as well as using a moisture checker to track the moisture of the stored product, were key things that were identified that farmers and traders closer to the farm production sites could use. One of the really exciting things that came out of this work actually on the socio-economic benefits, something that we still don't know a lot about in terms of the formal literature. And one of the key things that we looked at were how do we understand the socio-economic benefits, particularly for women, and focusing in on that community scale processing, not so much the industrial scale processing. We found established some new ways to collect that type of data using a range of different well-being factors and games essentially to enable that translation as well for people that are based in villages to be able to understand and give them a greater confidence in the actual working out what the implications are for processing for those local markets. So this really provided some unique insights into the seaweed farming and processing benefits for the women as they were able to have that type of stay. And because it was based on one-off type surveys, they were able to cast their mind back to before and after when seaweed farming had taken off in their village. And that provided some really powerful work. So the premise for this was the industry has definitely grown at an unprecedented rate. So what does the community perceive as being beneficial or negative about that? And so framing it around well-being and household benefits in a lot of the major production areas around South Sulawesi and the Takala region, the survey found and basically reported almost all positive economic and social impacts. And that's a little bit different from some of the literature on similar types of systems starting in Africa, for example. The extra income was being identified as being a really positive change that was going towards transport, so use of motorbikes, to housing and also other needs in education. So this well-being factor type approach really allows us to explore and unpack how that perceived change in these particular factors were happening over time. So the key things that were coming out were that there's transport consistently, housing, as well as these other types of needs were actually perceived to have changed and primarily linked back towards seaweed. And so that almost self-reinforcing factors around the well-being, contributing to seaweed farming, and seaweed farming contributing to well-being was something that Dr. Silva Larsen and team really decided to explore further, mostly because there were no negative changes that were found. And so there was this overwhelming sense of increasing life satisfaction, both interestingly, by the women that were their families were directly involved in farming, as well as those that were not necessarily involved in farming, but were in the village as well. So interesting scenario there. So Dr. Larsen and team took it further. They really wanted to try and understand from a theoretical point of view, especially given such a wonderful sort of system for this, around this well-being analysis and this SENS capability approach, which basically is about feedback loops in this case. And so when different items might be viewed as having a different role by different people, sort of in different contexts. And so how do all these sort of complex things where seaweed farming might be a small or a large part of their business, and the processing of foods from seaweed might also be there. So you have women that were involved in the farming, some that were just involved in processing, and some that were basically involved in both the farming and the processing. So being able to separate all of these things, and the great results that really came out there were that there are a number of different factors that were consistent, whether or not they were involved in farming or processing, and a lot of these contributed directly to their well-being, as well as feeding back to providing more resources to do the farming and to do the processing from a household point of view. And so the consistent things that came out, and please read the paper when it was published in the journal Ambio, is that social networks and transportation, particularly motorbikes, were important for all contexts. So these are key things that we need to focus in on in the future. And there are other types of factors in there as well that are certainly important for one rather than the other. So this provides that sort of type of context for government and policymakers to understand what happens if we start to invest more in seaweed, and hopefully these flow-on benefits will continue. Moving to some of the technical parts of the work that we've been doing, Objective 2 was to really target in on improving the quality of seaweeds produced at the farm level. So right at the farmer, the smallholder farmers and so many of them are across Indonesia, and particularly focused in eastern Indonesia. So one of the things that we wanted to do was really identify all these existing and emerging species of seaweed using molecular barcoding techniques. So Associate Professor Joe Zuccarello and the team were looking at the molecular identification, so using DNA barcoding techniques of Capophycus and Eucuma that we'll present here. So understanding what is that genetic diversity, but also training and building capacity within our Indonesian scientific partners to do that. We conducted lots of workshops and certainly built lots of great capacity there in terms of both technical in the laboratory, as well as the downstream work that happens in the software side of things, with some good sort of analysis and easy sayings, especially when we're collecting the samples for the DNA analysis. Really need such a tiny amount of seaweed, so lots of silica to make it nice and dry, and a little bit of seaweed. And so this was a foundational sort of work that led on to a number of different types of publications. So the first being is the request and published in the journal Squalene, Bulletin of Marine and Fisheries Post-Harvest and Biotechnology in Indonesia, by Joe and myself. And basically the premise is the tropics are one of the most rapid, as we all know why we're here in this workshop, the most rapidly expanding areas for seaweed production, but also the places where so little molecular ID has been done of the seaweeds. And of course, morphological methods are really fraught and they're unreliable. So we need this type of confidence that comes from the correct identification, especially those species or varieties or cultivars that we're commercially interested in. And that allows us to understand at that base level and truly compare the growth in biochemistry as well as the variation between different locations and environments and over time. And so a lot of the work and the beginner's guide to molecular ID of seaweed that was published was understanding the go-to-woe. How do you simply do from sample collection all the way through to analysis of the sequence data itself, with identifying all these different molecular markers for the different types of seaweeds, acknowledging that some of these markers can be used together to get a really good understanding of that. So the team then took this information and applied that process and protocols to understanding the genetic diversity of seaweed Capophycus that's being farmed across Indonesia using the COI gene. And so the reality is that many of the trade names and that are used by traders but also farmers don't reflect the evolutionary species, so where we're at with the phylogeny and especially the updated taxonomy. As we all know, it's very flexible, can change, and we have whole new genera emerging like Capophycus from Eucuma. So they are highly variable in morphology but also pigmentation. And Pustika Ratnawati from the Loka Gorontalo Rumput Laut Research Centre and the team, they basically showed that there's really low genetic variation with the COI gene, and basically the single haplotype across 13 of the Capophycus alvarezi cultivars across the country that they looked at. And this genetic, or very limited genetic variation, contrasts really clearly with this high phenotypic variation in both colour and morphology across the different species. So obviously there's more to be done there to unpack what's going on at the genetic level. But for now it is often the single haplotype that's there, but this gives us the opportunity to develop or have the confidence anyway to know that even with limited genetic variation in this particular marker, there's still a lot of phenotypic variation and optimization that can be done. So once the genetic variation of the stocks is sort of understood, we have that base knowledge then for maintaining the existing cultivars as well as continuing to look for new particular ones. And of the 14 different sites that they looked at, just to put it in perspective, 13 of those were Capophycus alvarezi and only one of them was number 14 here from Sumbawa, was actually striatus. So almost all production in these key areas that we looked at were to do with Capophycus alvarezi. So once the understanding of the genetics is done, we still need to go right back to the farm level to try and understand how to improve the quality and enhance those gel yields. And what was really missing was a range of production trials across Indonesia. So are there things that the farmers can be doing to manage their production better? And then is there a basis for any selective breeding or targeted cultivation of particular cultivars or strains? One of the concepts that we floated early on that the Loka team really embraced was this idea of how maybe we can rejuvenate some of the old strains rather than having to go down those technically challenging pathways of tissue culture or trying to get reproduction to happen under controlled conditions for Capophycus. And so a lot of the feedback from the discussions with the farmers was that there is so much variation and they understand that there's variation. So how do we actually start to quantify that seasonal and regional variation in both the production, the growth, as well as the product quality, because that hasn't been systematically addressed before. So the paper by Nova Simatupang and team from the Loka Gorontalo basically we're able to go to those key production areas, those 10 different sites, using standard production techniques, fixed style of culturing, collection and water quality monitoring as well, and looking at how much variation do the farms have when they're conducted at a pretty similar time of the year, using these standardised techniques from the team. And so the answer is there's a lot of variation almost in every trait that we're interested in. Production, you can see almost variation in 4 times the amount of productivity in grams per metre of rope. The carrageenan content ranged from 8 up to over 26, so 3 times difference. The gel strength, about the same, 3 times difference, as well as the viscosity, almost 4 times difference there. So lots and lots of variation. So being able to grow the seaweed at these different sites, even in the same types of techniques, means that there's still this intrinsic variation. So a bit of an indication that the cultivars themselves are going to be interesting to look at. And so that was the next step. Patrani and team, senior researcher at the Loka Gorontalo for Rumput Laut, then conducted what we call a common garden type approach. So rather than conducting growth trials in the same way at the farm sites across Indonesia, bringing those cultivars back to a single site in this case, and testing their capacity under the growth under the same conditions. And so there was a seaweed estate established by Loka Gorontalo at Pungkep in South Sulawesi. Lots of monitoring of the water quality conditions and established scenarios where different types of strains were being brought. And so that publication has just been submitted to the Indonesian Aquaculture Journal, so stay tuned for that. So what it did lead to was a couple of key target cultivars that were most consistently producing high quality and high productivity. So the Mamuju and the Sumlaki cultivars, so they're different regions of the country. And these are under culture still at the time. Please listen to Patrani's workshop talk as well as discuss that there, because it's a pretty exciting new approach for that. The third part of the work, after working on the value chain, the socioeconomics and the production farming side, was what wonderful new products can the team start to produce? And for that, we actually need to step back a little bit and identify some of those product opportunities. Biotech in Jakarta, the major partner there, Centre for Research and Development, had already been progressing this type of work, so we're able to leverage that and start to really look at some of these other particular angles. And all of that comes back to often the biochemical data, so making sure we're collecting samples, getting good analyses of both the proximate and ultimate analyses and mineral profiles as a way to understand, are there actually new applications or even new applications for the byproducts of seaweed production and processing. Some of the key things that I'll share with you today, different types of processing techniques that might be able to be done either at a cottage or a larger scale. Some of these pre-processing steps have turned out to be very exciting with publications here. We're able to get pigments and salts, or biosalt as it's being called, which is using the sap that can be collected during the drying process. So one of the science papers behind that was actually using scanning electron microscopy to understand what salt minerals are found where across both the surface of the seaweed and in the cross-section. And some of the salt naturally is pulled out to the surface upon drying, and that contains a high level of potassium chloride and sodium chloride, as well as some sulfur and other components, whereas inside, it's much more sulfated polysaccharides, as well as some of those salts again. So depending on which process is used, it's sometimes even just collecting the salt from the peripheral part of the dried seaweed under normal processing might be okay, but the biosalt is really the ability to pull that out in the sap and actually collect that rather than letting the water dry off and evaporate into the atmosphere. These types of new salt products, or sap, might be coming out of the Capophycus first, but then what about the leftover, the residual seaweed, which of course people are interested in carrageenan. So the studies then moved on to how different is that particular seaweed, which has already had the sap extracted for a classic alkaline treated carrageenan process, as well as developing some new processes, in particular called organic powdered cotton which the team have then looked at, can it be incorporated as a proportion of edible films, and with all these new different ways of actually getting the seaweed and getting the carrageenan out, are there some better standard protocols or ways to make sure that you can compare the gel strength and other key attributes amongst it? So take a look at those papers too. So the sap-free seaweed, basically the seaweed which has had that liquid extracted out, are there ways to use the sort of existing types of ATC, alkali treated process? And the reality is that with some modelling and varying the concentration, the potassium hydroxide and the temperature and the time of processing, that these things can certainly be done to make sure that the yields and the quality of that gel are close to what it might be beforehand. One of the most exciting new avenues, really, given the large amount of processing that already exists in Indonesia of eukumatoids, but the intent to process more and more with more facilities being built across the country, is what to do with all the waste streams. So there's both liquid and solid waste streams, and the amounts of waste of both of those types vary depending on the species. So Gracilaria, for example, being quite different from Capophycus. So the biotech R&D centre in Jakarta have worked on a range of different types of products, especially Jamal Basmal, and basically his team have identified all these different types of agricultural productions, even making seaweed bricks out of the waste products, and publishing lots of different papers. So one of the new areas they're looking at is, can they start to make this organic liquid fertilizer with components of the seaweed waste, both the solid and the liquid, and testing that in relevant types of systems. Example here in this publication with lettuce head, and certainly working on many more different types of things there. So stay tuned on that regards. Last but not least, certainly my favourite types of things at the end of a long talk is some sugar. And one of the really exciting new pathways for developing products is right back at the grassroots level. So especially in Sulawesi Selatan, there's lots of women's groups. These are the same women's groups that we were exploring in the first part of the socioeconomic work, and they're creating every type of seaweed-based product that you can imagine under the sun. So there's lots of recipe innovations and some real interest to understand the nutritional side of that. So looking to populate their products with nutritional panels so that the consumer is confident about what they're eating, as well as a whole lot of other biochemical actives. So from both a functionality point of view, so using the gels and the like for particular types of products, as well as a whole range of these pharmaceuticals, whether they're cosmeceuticals, nutraceuticals. These are these high-value applications that the Indonesian partners are really interested in and have explored so many already. Some of the last parts of work that we're about to look at publishing are not classic academic literature, far better. There's going to be a Makassar seaweed recipe book, and that's really based on this wonderful entrepreneurial spirit of all of the women's groups across Sulawesi Selatan, making every type of sweet, savoury product that you can imagine, including my favourite, old school, using the seaweed for ice cream, and some wonderful stories there that will be attached to the recipe book too. So we'll explore more of that, I'm sure, in the workshop. So in conclusion, we approached the whole project. It was a 5-year project. It's literally just finished earlier this year in terms of activities, and we're now synthesizing all the data and getting the reports together. We started to look across lots of different parts, which is a pretty significant undertaking, but we've been able to go and really identify some really interesting pathways whether it's right at the packaged food and beverage end, so these artisanal small business products, looking at the new types of carrageenan, so the organic powdered cottoneye and the alkali treated cottoneye that's coming from the sap-free seaweed. Large effort in terms of converting these wastes into a whole range of agricultural products, so doing the whole circular economy there. Even the dried seaweed can be going straight into our products, especially if it's come from high quality, consistent sort of products, so that we can identify the bioactives and have the confidence around those going into ingredients, so that they have either general or potentially even high level health claims. These pigments and the biosalt will certainly be playing in that space, and ultimately right down to a whole range of rejuvenated cultivars where farmers are able to have access to a range of different types of seed stock that can be tailored to their different parts. So next steps, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are such a clearly wonderful backdrop for us to be considering everything when it comes to tropical seaweed production. What we're going to see is more and more effort, though, I believe, understanding these broader environmental and social benefits of the seaweed industry. There's a lot of technical work that's been done, but we need to do a lot more to be able to really demonstrate and account for the environmental benefits and ecosystem services, whether it's carbon or nitrogen from the seaweed production, as well as understand those social impacts, which might be so much deeper and hopefully positive than what we may have thought yet. It's been a very productive project, and we've had more than 26 publications in many different journals. And I'd just like to say a big thank you to the team, those that are in the photograph from our last meeting pre-COVID. It's been very disappointing to not get over there in person, and to the many more partners involved across all of the different Indonesian research agencies working on rumput laut, such an enthusiastic and productive multidisciplinary team. We have a similar diverse team at the University of the Sunshine Coast, a really dynamic research group, and please take a look for us, and happy to answer any questions on the day or in any other time. Thank you for listening.